Hello, everybody, and welcome to the September 10th meeting to review DefCore progress so far. Tonight's focus topic is designated sections, but we're going to start with some review of the history. My name is Rob Hirschfeld. I'm one of the co-chairs of the DefCore committee, and our job is to define the commercial use of OpenStack brand as for vendors who are basically selling OpenStack using the integrated release as a base. And we make that definition using, actually I have a definition page up here. We make that definition using the capabilities that are defined by the board through the DefCore process. Capabilities are effectively API statements that decompose projects into capabilities. Code, which is the topic for tonight, so there's specific components of the code that we expect vendors to use, and then the capabilities are validated using tests. So we use the Tempest tests as our check step. In the past, we've called that Faithful Implementation Test Suite. In this case, we're really calling it DefCore Capabilities Tests. The vendors must pass those tests. And then that drives interoperability and minimum standards. It's all about commercial products and trademarks. A lot of times people get confused and think that we're applying the core statement to the integrated release. The integrated release and the projects that are in the integrated release are the domain of the TC, the technical committee, for defining what projects are in or out. We actually add an additional filter for commercial users to know which tests they have to pass, which is defined capabilities, and then which code they're expected to include in that release. And I'm going to spend a couple minutes explaining that and explaining the process, and then I can do that hopefully pretty quickly, but it helps stage up the question at hand, which is, how do we pick which code that is? And I don't have links specifically to it, but if accessed across my blog, there's a lot of material that we've put together. I use my blog as sort of our test engine for DefCore, and a lot of the DefCore ideas that we're going are discussed there. And so if you're interested in really seeing a lot of material, I think I've written a small book about DefCore through my blog, and I'd recommend going through, searching DefCore, and you can certainly read about process flow and different components that we've had for that. So that's DefCore at a high level. The brief history of DefCore is that at Hong Kong, the board came up with 10 principles that were guiding how we would define core. Because it applies to commercial use of the OpenStack trademark, it has a significant commercial financial impact to a lot of the people in the ecosystem. And so we have to be very deliberative in how we do this. The principles were our first attempt to start going through this, and they defined that we were talking about core as a subset of the overall release, not the whole project, that it could be used both for private and public clouds. So there's one core. In the future, we may have submarks or specialized marks, but right now we're working on a single mark for core. We expect that there will be, that vendors will use OpenStack's code. It's a very important statement. OpenStack is a code project. It's not an API spec. So we expect vendors to use the code. And we expect within that, vendors will be able to substitute parts with what we call alternate implementations. They can use, but don't have to use, an open reference implementation. So they have a choice for that. Tonight what we're doing is we're actually talking about how they know which parts are the parts they have to use and which parts they can substitute. The place we've been working towards before this is all about these orange sections, which is about tests, which tests are required, how we pick which tests are required, and things like that. And so if you look at that, what we do is we look at the body of tests that are available in each release. We score those based on 12 criteria. This graphic shows these 12 criteria. They have 4 general categories. We actually score all of the tests together. From that, we come up with a matrix. This was our first pass. We're working to automate this more. But by using those 12 factors, we can score different capability groups. So tests are blocked together into capability groups. The capability groups are scored. That tells us which capabilities are required for OpenStack implementation. If your blood pressure is going up, it's very important to understand we're doing this for Havana first in an advisory capability. So this will be enforced in the Icehouse release, and we'll actually expect vendors to pass the tests that we've identified as must-pass tests based on which capabilities those tests are in. We are doing it against Havana in an advisory way because we want to have people engaged with real information where you can actually say, well, wait a second, if you said that, a really good example, I'll pick on Swift because Swift ends up being the one people crystallize on. Swift is the object store object case. It's scored at the very edge. 75 was our cutoff. It's one of the ones right on the cutoff. We have people who believe very strongly that Swift should be included as a required capability, and we have an almost equal number of the community who thinks that Swift should not be a required capability. And so the purpose of laying out the list like this is for people to be able to understand how we make the decisions and then have a dialogue now that we actually say, well, it looks like Swift should be included based on these scores. It's been bringing people out into the community now that they actually understand what we're talking about. So we've gone from very general principles to a criteria system to actually having the results. And we want people to engage in the results now that it's much clearer to say, here's why Swift is in or here's why Swift is out. And the same is true with all these. Another one that attracts attention is Keystone. In Havana, there were no tests for Keystone version 2, which was the test that we would have considered for core. Consequently, Keystone isn't a required capability in Havana based on these scores. There just weren't any tests. There's plenty for version 3, but that wasn't stable, and so it didn't pass our other tests. So hopefully, I'm sort of glossing through a lot of material. I'll pause for questions in a couple of minutes. People can see how we've been building up this process, how we're making the decisions, very importantly, what the impact of those decisions are. And then if you want to question, should Swift be a core capability or not, instead of arguing the big stand in the corner and shout, I think it is, I don't think it is, you can actually say, you know what, I think that it's not really used by tools. You scored that it is used by tools, and we should adjust that. If we change that one thing, it would change the score, and then we'd reconsider whether it was or not. And so it becomes a much more targeted conversation and ultimately more data-driven, which is how we want to make these decisions. Doesn't mean people don't think that it's wrong. We have plenty of people who tell us that they disagree with the decisions. We're trying to make them in a way that decomposes them in a meaningful way for the community. And to me, very importantly, gives the community rules and guidelines about what works or doesn't work. All right. I have a no. What is the no? Can people hear me?
Yeah, Rob, it was for the question you had before we started.
Thank you. I just pulled up the chat. I wasn't perfect. Okay.
No.
Yeah, when I do these long monologues, sometimes it's nice to make sure that the sound hasn't cut out. The next thing to show, this actually would need its own meeting to review, and if we need to, we'll take questions on this too. We've been working through trying to walk people through how this process works. This meeting is actually on this process chart. It's as part of this community input bubble here. The idea is very simply, and I just wrote a blog post about this whole process flow. We're creating documents that have capabilities in them and also designated sections in them, and we're going to use Garrett as a review process so that we can collect community input in a very audited way, and people can make patches and changes against these documents, and then we can certify, yes, this is the approved version, and have it go through a regular Garrett process. So this flow shows a lot of different things going on, but fundamentally the idea is we're going to have documents for capabilities, documents for sections, and those will be run through the process. I feel like I'm forgetting, oh, I do have the onion. And so this is a graphic that we put together to help explain the interaction between the API capabilities and the designated sections of code. So the integrated release is composed of multiple projects. Of those projects, some of them have required capabilities, what we call core capabilities, and some do not. Not all of the capabilities in every project are core. We made the decision that none of the admin APIs are considered core. So we wanted the core, which is a requirement if you're going to have core work for public cloud and private cloud, that you have to have only the public, the non-admin APIs. Of the projects that have core capabilities, for those we care about whether or not they have designated code. And the idea here is designated code is code which is common for all deployments. It should be stable. It should be some reference code that we expect people to do, and it also tells the vendors this is where we expect you to play upstream. If you're VMware and you don't care about the KVM driver and how the KVM driver works in Nova, you're probably not going to include that in your distro. You might just ignore it, but you don't have to. And so you would have an alternate implementation of that driver. And so we want to have it very clear within the projects which things vendors are expected to implement and use, and which things they can substitute. That goes back to the original principles from Havana. And this is an Apache 2 project, so this isn't going to be an inspection with code police running around checking every vendor. This is guidance to help the community understand what's included when somebody buys an OpenStack product. And it also, the other thing that's significant, there are a number of people in the community who don't want us to have an API-only product and would be feel very strongly that if somebody re-implemented OpenStack in Go or Java or Erlang or Lisp, pick your language, with a completely new code base, even if it was open source, they still feel that wouldn't be OpenStack. That would be somebody using the OpenStack APIs. And at this point, this process is driven for an API plus code certification of core. We have deliberately pushed the conversation about an API-only version of OpenStack or API compatibility version of OpenStack down the stream. It's not on the table for discussion. In these meetings, we obviously talk about things like that all the time, but it's not something we're going to discuss as an option for core at this point. I say that because there are times when we do get into discussions where people want to add bring that in as an option, and we've been doing this process sort of in a very slow, methodical way, and there are certain things that we've as a board decided to postpone because they were too contentious, or we didn't feel like there was a consensus, and we're really working on a consensus-driven process for core. With that, I've done my 15 minutes of intro. Questions, concerns, something I missed that we should review? Excellent. I'm going to take silence as a no. I mean, so several of you have heard, Stefano and Rocky, you've heard me do this review multiple times now. Is there something you'd highlight in that?
Sounded good to me.
Okay. I've gotten a lot of practice, but I sometimes.
He's getting better.
Excellent. So I'm going to try and stick in this order, more or less. So, there is something I forgot to put on screen. Okay. So in designated sections, there's another component here, which I happily called "Your Baby is Ugly." So one of the challenges that we have with any of these operations around core is that people have a tendency to look at core as a value statement. This is the important code, this is the unimportant code. And unfortunately, people will do that, and I understand the rationale. It really is supposed to be, this is the stable, mature code that we are relying on, and separating the mature code from the innovative, changing, fluid code. It's not a matter of importance. The innovation is incredibly important to OpenStack. Stability is incredibly important to OpenStack because we build on it. So both are important. And so from that perspective, when we say your baby is ugly, we're saying all babies are ugly. Right? That's the reference. And we're looking for the adults in the OpenStack project, if you will, the things that people can depend on being there, release to release to release, that have shown signs of stability. And so when we pick designated code, we start with 7 items that came out of the TC, and are pretty straightforward for this. They're technically driven. There are things that provide the standard API or common functionality or cross-platform logic, right? Those are things we want to say, this is the core requirement for making the project stable. And then we look at things that shouldn't be designated, right? Vendor specific. We were talking about KVM versus VMware as an example. Things that are intended to be replaceable, we talk about scheduler usually as an example for that. Things that extend the REST API, so the API extensions. Interestingly, some of those could end up being required capabilities if they're very popular, but they're still extensions from the designations perspective. And code that's being deprecated should clearly not be designated. And then those are all technical considerations. When DefCore looks at this, we added 3 additional pieces that we felt were important because the board isn't in a position to make technical decisions. We're really taking advice from the technical community, and so the board looks at these additional pieces. The first is that by default things are not designated. And that really allows us to take this very innovative project with a lot of flux in it and not have to think that we have to filter, we have to say no to things that are new. What we really want to do is only bring things into core. So every time we look at core from a board perspective, we're trying to have a small core that grows in a predictable way rather than a large core that we have to cut things out of. So that's the first component. The next one is consensus-based designation. So if we have a topic, Swift is a great example, where some people say, I think it works like this, and some people say, I don't agree, it works someplace else. The board has to make a decision about what's core or not core for every release in a timely manner. It's a requirement from a commercial success perspective to be able to tell vendors, yes, you can certify Juno within a reasonable time period after Juno because it's commercial, it's a required commercial mark. Therefore, if there's going to be a prolonged fight about something, the board's position, DefCore's position, and this is moving to board approval next next week, is that we don't, we say it's not designated. There's too much controversy here. And if somebody's really trolling on this, just objecting to everything, we'll spirit that out. I assume that we are smart enough to identify that. And then finally, that it's guidance. So the goal here is not, once again, to create code police. Our goal is to be able to say, generally, this part of the project is designated, this part is not designated. So saying scheduler, the Nova scheduler is not designated, is considered sufficient. We don't have to point to the code libraries or pieces and parts like that that are more articulate. We're assuming intelligent technical people can use this guidance and make reasonable decisions. Okay. And I suspect we'll come back to these definitions. It's important to understand these because they do influence some of how this decision ends up being made. And then I'll remind everybody that if the code has no required capabilities, it could have designated sections, but they're really not enforceable. So if you're not required, so Neutron has no required capabilities. Therefore, we could designate sections, but vendors wouldn't be required to implement them because they're not required to use Neutron. In this case, we haven't yet determined designated sections for Neutron. The project's in a lot of flux. I'd love to see us define some, but once again, they wouldn't apply. Heat's not a core capability, so there's no designated sections. Horizon's not a core capability, so there's no position. Keystone is not designated, is not a required capability, so it is not designated. We don't have any designated sections for Keystone. Keystone's probably the next interesting one. They're in Havana, and once again, we're only talking about Havana. In Havana, there are alternative Keystone that didn't use any of the Keystone code but complied with the API. So the consensus in DefCore was that there was no designated code in Keystone because there were 100% alternate implementations for Havana. That this might and should be changing as we progress into newer releases. I'll pause for discussion. And you'll note that we actually have some comments here, and these I've been trying to capture and keep in the going forward document so we can talk about it. Any concerns about replacement of Keystone? Not having a designated section for Keystone. Excellent. Okay. And I would say this isn't people's only bite at this apple. If you have concerns about this and you don't bring it up on the call and you're just monitoring or listening, or you're listening to the recording and you can't, then please don't hesitate to bring it up to the DefCore list or email me directly, send me a letter, however you need to get in touch with me, or anybody on the DefCore committee. We do want to have the discussions. I will tell you the board does have to make a recommendation, and the recommendations for this will be made on the 18th, so that we'll have a Havana advisory. We will, of course, repeat the process. Repeat the process for every release. So if the ones for Havana, we get feedback that we did it wrong, you have a chance, we all have a chance to correct this as we talk about Icehouse and further releases. Good.
Hi, this is George from VMware.
Excellent.
I attended the last few meetings, and we said that PTLs from different projects will review and give a feedback. Did that happen? Is there any feedback from the team leads?
I don't have feedback from specific PTLs yet, except for the Swift PTL. We are working to collect that, and any advice from them is welcome. But we are, Thierry and I are engaged in coordinating with them. They have a JSON version of this document for review, and we're still trying to collect feedback. This list is actually many months old, and so it has been reviewed and vetted by the TC. And the Lighthouse 6 has some discussion around those points.
Okay.
Yeah. But please review, and once again, any commentary is helpful. Let's do Nova next. Nova is an interesting case. The feeling on Nova is that it is designated by default. So we feel like the majority of the Nova project is designated code, and we would expect a vendor to ship it. And we chose to have exceptions in this case, so that we're specifically not designating code for Nova. And those non-designated areas are the scheduler, the filter scheduler drivers and weights. And so the compute driver, REST API extensions, and Nova networking components and drivers, right, which is one of those deprecated, hopefully deprecated components within the infrastructure. So and I'll pause for discussion. Usually Nova seems pretty straightforward for people. And one of the things that we've done in the JSON I don't think I'm still logged in now. So I actually have a patch outstanding here that there we go. I need to see what Tom thinks. But there is a sections. So in this case, that actually goes through and looks at the comments and has more description. So one of the things I've done is I've taken this list and I've started with this list as for descriptions and comments, but there's a lot of missing pieces. And so as we get this this section done, release to release, what I'm expecting is that we will be able to build release to release on the sections and see where things go. All right. So people are encouraged to add detail into that document as it becomes a living document, and so we can start building up more descriptive information about why something's designated or not, and what the actual scope of that designation means. Okay. Nova, so no additional conversation around Nova. Okay. Cinder. Cinder, the designated sections are the API implementation code. So within Cinder, there's a lot of drivers and different pieces for the drivers. Those are all vendor specific. There is a reference implementation. Reference implementations are not designated. They're replaceable. So the primary component for Cinder becomes the API framework and infrastructure around the API. And I think my expectation is that most projects are going to end up having a description that looks something like this. We seem to be building a lot of OpenStack projects that have API frameworks with pluggable backends, and I would expect a lot of projects to implement something like this. There are projects like Oslo that would have a much more integrated piece, but there's no exposed capabilities for that project, so it is, while we could dictate, yes, it's 100% designated, and I'd love to see it on the list, it's one of those ones where if you're implementing the code, you'll use it, but we're not going to require people to. Be an interesting substitution for somebody to make. Okay, I'm pausing again for questions. We've gone through all of the recommendations that we're going to put before the board, with the exception of Swift. And we have plenty of time to discuss Swift, or if necessary, discuss the broader sections. So Swift is an interesting project for a couple of reasons. Havana Swift, and we're talking about Havana Swift, not Swift in Icehouse or in Juneau. And so in the discussions that we've had around Havana Swift, the PTLs identified different sections that were different components and things like that that he thought should be designated. We've had people in the community come forward and say that they use the Swift API, but they have replaced the code, generally with Ceph. It's not the only alternate Swift implementation, but in those cases, the substitutions have replaced all of Swift and re-implemented the APIs. And these are products that are actually existing in market and have been in market. And so the feeling is that while Swift APIs are a required capability, the actual implementation of Swift for Havana is not designated. Okay. And the primary argument for that one is not a technical argument. The primary argument for that is that there are different people who have had alternate implementations and do not believe that there is a part of the Swift code in Havana that they could use as a common framework, and they've had to substitute the whole implementation.
I have a question for Rob.
Please.
So, what if a vendor decides that they don't need any sort of object store, such as Ceph, that they can store on their block storage devices just fine, and so there isn't any interface to an object storage, since there are APIs that are required for that. The code's not required because the APIs are required. Sorry.
Right. No, I understand exactly what you're saying. It's an excellent question. And it's, I'll give you two answers. One is, that's off topic for the meeting. And I say that, in Rocky, you and I know each other really well. I'm saying that just because we're supposed to be talking about designated sections. And so part of what we've had to do is compartmentalize discussions like that. That said, I actually think it's worth discussing exactly that question. and so what I would do is I'd ask to hold that if somebody wants to talk about the Swift designated sections topic first, and then come back to is Swift a required capability later. Is that all right?
Works for me. Thanks.
Okay. So, one of the things that is interesting to note with the Swift designated sections is that the same people who have said Swift doesn't have designated sections for Havana have looked at Juneau and felt that it does, and that they would be willing to accept designated sections in Juneau. And so this is one of the things that's very interesting to me is as we look at time series, it's very likely that we're going to have changes release to release to release. So a statement today does not change, that Swift doesn't have designated sections for Havana could likely be changed in Icehouse or in Juneau.
Hi Rob, Tom here.
Hey.
So I've heard that statement a couple of times, and so far I haven't seen any information like any specifics around that. Somehow there's this apparent difference between Havana and Juno that I just haven't seen specified at all.
We had a discussion around this in I think Lighthouse 5. I'm trying to see if we have specific notes. I'll summarize as best I can. The proxy components and the way the performance of the proxy components in the Juno version of Swift, and once again, I'm not giving a technical assessment. I'm trying to repeat what I've heard. Is that those proxy elements are usable against different backends, and the proxy can be used in a performant way to implement the Swift APIs without using the Swift backend store. And this was Simon Anderson from DreamHost was making this statement. That
yeah. So basically, that doesn't make sense to me at all, because the proxy hasn't materially changed between Havana and Juno. So if that was a serious basis for designating or not designating a particular thing, I'd expect to see some more specifics around that, considering we're talking about designated sections, which are actually, part of the code, kind of technical box of information.
That's fair enough. And so so John has provided a actual set of sections that he believes the project can be decomposed into, and we have not yet had a full community discussion around how those sections operate and how they can be done. Let me see if I can dig them up. Hold on. Do you have a position?
No, my position is just open communication and information. That's all I'm really after.
Okay. All right, let me see what I can. I'm sorry if I'm hiding the screen. Here we go. All right, so from John, he emailed this to the DefCore list. I believe I actually have, let me see, I think these are the same ones. Yes. Okay. Yeah, so I have exactly the ones that he had identified in here. So he has identified the proxy server as a designated section, and these other pieces. And I think these are reasonable components, sections of the code to figure out whether they are designated or not. At this point, we have people saying that they are not using any of those to re-implement the Swift APIs. And so there's a technical disagreement within the community as to how to implement those APIs.
Indeed. Just to throw out some data for you, particularly around the designated section Swift that's labeled middleware there.
Mm-hmm.
So basically how the Swift proxy works is when you connect to it, it goes through, it has a list of Python modules, basically. And it goes through them one by one in a pipeline format. And that basically does various things with your response, or it takes action. So, for example, if you wanted to add S3 support to your Swift, you insert the S3, thing on the middleware pipeline.
Okay.
And that's actually really fantastic from an operator or a perspective, and something that in my previous role we used. Basically, you can choose whether or not you want to offer things like the ability to provide static web indexes, or you can actually completely change how the authorization works in Swift and that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So that's a pretty strong, modification point, I guess, because it's
Right.
right on the entry and you can do a lot with it. But anyway, I'll be quiet. Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. I was going to say that, and that's one of the things identified as a replaceable section. So expanding the middleware, adding new middleware is identified as replaceable. Whoops, hello?
I'm done.
Oh, okay. This is in a way the same challenge that we have with Keystone, where there were significant implementations of Keystone that people felt that the Keystone infrastructure was not adequate to their needs and they had to replace it.
And like I said before, I'd like that code with Keystone as well to also be itemized. Because if we're using this conversation as a basis for choosing designated sections or not, it would be really great to have the particular technical things that were wrong just written down. So in the future, when we're revisiting the sections for Icehouse, for example, as you said, we might experience change. We can go back and say, oh, well, actually, tick, 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 they're all solved in Icehouse. Fantastic. We don't have the problem anymore.
I strongly concur. Yes, that's exactly the. I want to have us do exactly what you're saying. This is the thing. Here's a description of what it does, and here's the rationale for there being a problem with it. The challenge that we have from a board perspective is I really can't have the board trying to make a technical distinction. We sort of have to throw things up, say, does this make sense to people? Does the community generally agree? If so, it makes sense. If not, we still have to make a decision. And
I absolutely understand that. That's why I think it's very important to do these kind of specification and writing down tasks sooner rather than later, so the community can actually look at that and say, gee, that's not right, or, oh yes, we completely agree.
Right. And that was one of our decisions to make Havana Advisory, was for exactly this reason, because our experience has been that the only time people really engage really productively is when they have a list of designated sections, and they can say, well, what does that mean? Why are you objecting to this? And how do we address it? So it sounds like we're in violent agreement on how we address this going forward.
Yes, though I think there's an issue of timing. I think my preference is to specify the technical detail a little bit earlier than what you recommended. I think what you prefer to do is specify the section as advisory and then do the technical detail in parallel. What I'd recommend is instead writing that stuff down before you can even make those advisory sections, because otherwise you haven't had a community discussion around them.
I agree with you very strongly. Back in February, I was having conversations about this same topic with the TC, asking them to do exactly that. So it's not, unfortunately, it's not that we haven't been trying to collect the information. It's that in collecting the information, we also expose the politics, and the deadlines do end up driving people to act, and more than starting in February when the deadlines aren't as pressing. And I'm the only way I've found that we're able to actually drive this is for us to make a statement, take a position on this, and then have people say, oh, wait, I actually need to start providing this information. It hasn't been for lack of trying to engage the technical community.
And that's what's happened now. You've got the list of concrete recommendations. They haven't been advised to the board yet. They haven't been voted on. They should be widely circulated with the rationale behind them. So far, the list of sections has been circulated, which has been fantastic, and congratulations on getting that point. I know how hard it was. The technical rationale is lacking so far, and if we're going to have a serious conversation before, what is it, the 22nd of September, we're running out of time to provide that technical rationale.
You're exactly right. I would welcome any additional discussion on that.
One perspective is that if the technical rationale doesn't exist, then the decision shouldn't be made.
Decision, we can't keep postponing the decision. Which way would you have us make the decision if we don't have enough data?
Well, basically, we've got right now that, we're excluding something based on a particularly shady set of ideas. Take Swift, for example. We're excluding it basically because some guy said something kind of non-specific about something he couldn't use, so he had to re-implement it. And that, at the moment, is our entire justification for not designating Swift.
Correct.
And I don't think that's acceptable. So instead, we should try, for example, as you said before, forcing action from people. Why don't you try flipping Swift around, designate everything, and then the people who really, were unhappy with that might be able to then be forced to provide such information.
Hold on just a moment. Okay. To let me out, or? Okay, so I'm okay, I can just go? Okay, sorry. I was having this meeting at the OpenStack meetup in Austin, and they're closing the place down around me. I'm fine to go, they were just giving me a thing. This is, the original goal for this was that the technical, the TC would actually drive designated sections, and that it would actually be a TC-owned item, and the TC's position was that code would be designated by default. In the board's case, we have to choose designated by default or not designated by default, and we felt that we couldn't take a position to force vendors to use a section if there was an agreement that it was that they could implement it. And so we're defaulting to not. I'm happy to have the conversation. I'm happy to drive it forward.
Yeah, when you say the boards, you're probably referring to the DefCore committee?
DefCore is the board's committee on this process. That's correct.
Yes, but that wasn't a full board decision.
It is not yet a full board decision. It will be presented to the board next week.
Yeah. So I disagree. I've got to say, I personally disagree with the idea of not designating due to lack of consensus. I disagree with that principle. But I would recommend that you look again at that decision about whether to designate by default or not. Because at the moment, the justification is very, very shaky without that technical information. So it would be unwise, I think, to have a full board vote on something that isn't well justified.
The principle or the code base itself?
I was referring to the designated sections. So basically, the recommendation there should be well justified.
I appreciate your position. I think that...
well, in this case, what you've got is you've got a specific guy. You've got Simon Anderson. He happens to also be a board member. You have the ability to ask him today to provide that technical information.
Yeah, no, and I don't have an objection to doing that. He wasn't the only person who came forward to make that statement. Piston Cloud and IBM also made similar statements. This is
and you can also follow up with them to get them to provide that information.
I certainly can, and it is part of the process of what we're trying to do going forward. I can tell you they showed up at the appropriate time, and we had a discussion about it, and they objected based on that. And at some point, I can keep this open and have back and forths on it. and we can get appropriate information. We can collect more and more information, but I don't know how to close a discussion where people have different opinions. They've taken different actions. We have an Apache 2 licensed code base where they have the option to license or not. We can certainly drive more data. I'd love to have more data. I'd love to have people lay out what their rationale are. I think all those are reasonable. We have had meetings where that's been done.
So why hasn't that been recorded then? At the moment, we've got no data, Rob.
We actually have minutes from those meetings where those statements were made. I don't have recordings of those meetings. We don't record every meeting. It's not. We often record meetings, but we don't record all meetings.
Indeed, that's an unfortunate oversight. But I think it's pretty reasonable to expect that if you're making a decision such as this one, it should be grounded in actual information, rather than some vague conversations that weren't very well minuted.
I actually take objection to those statements. We had minutes. We wrote them down. You're welcome to review them. They were.
Well, I read them all. I couldn't find anything solid.
Once again, we have differences of opinions. How would you like me to resolve the differences of opinions? I'm happy to go back to the community and the people who made those statements and ask them to do additional justifications. But
Yep,
there,
so
I can tell you at the end of the day, they're going to say we don't think this code should be included.
Yep, and that's completely fine. But it should be, this code should not be included, no designated code, and it should be, this is the reason why. At the moment, when you're producing the information, there isn't that following reason why. And I think, realistically, we're only talking about Keystone and Swift here. I think everything else has had quite good agreement. But the fact is that all this wiki says is no designated code for Havana Swift due to lack of consensus. And, alternative implementations. It doesn't say why there was alternative implementations. It doesn't say what was lacking. We've got no ability as a community to actually look at that decision and kind of judge it.
I agree. We need better documentation of what those reasons are.
That's right. So that should be done well before any board meeting so that there's an appropriate amount of time for the community to discuss the issues with the information.
I can give you what the reason was behind IBM's and that is that they actually package with as a separate component so that people can actually have Swift without OpenStack and OpenStack without Swift.
Correct. And Rocky, this is we have not had time to talk about your issue, which is also something that has been brought up based on people's review of the actual information. And I've had significant number of people come to me and say, I don't think that the Swift capabilities are actually core. We don't include them. And that the board, which has actually passed the capability set, should reconsider the Swift capabilities as to whether they're core or not. And in that case, the Keystone designated sections are moot because Keystone has no required capabilities. Withdrawing Swift from the required capabilities list would also make this question moot.
Anyway, Rob, I think I've put my objections forward. Unfortunately, I've got to go to another meeting now, but thank you so much for all your work.
My pleasure. Thank you. Rocky, I believe that the question you're asking will be part of the board dialogue about designated sections.
Okay.
I've had enough people come to me asking us to consider that, revisit that, and considering the lack of consensus around SWIFT in general. It is definitely one of the topics of the board meeting next week to reevaluate whether or not SWIFT has a required capability. And I think the conversation we just had only underscores the idea that we are likely not ready to have the designated sections conversation about SWIFT. And I think it's very reasonable to ask for more detail and more discussion about that. If you will, the board's simpler approach for this is to just remove those capabilities and move forward.
Right.
And while I'd love to make data-driven, very specific decisions with a lot of people providing concrete examples, there are times when the board, as a decision-making entity, needs to see where there's controversy and pick a consensus view.
Agreed.
So, excellent. We've definitely gone our hour. We have had some stimulating debate and discussion about the designated sections and the collection of information, which I think is very good feedback. Any other additional comments or concerns to raise before we close the call?
Just one. Did you put me on the morning call?
If you can join it, I would love to have you on the morning call.
Okay.
We'll see what interesting things get discussed there. Excellent, everybody. Thank you and good night. I appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.